Black Waitress took a mysterious call in Chinese. She was fired in next day. The waves crashed relentlessly against the jagged cliffs of Marrow Bay, a forgotten corner of the coastline where the wind always seemed to carry stories it couldn't finish. High above, perched on a rocky outcrop like a stubborn sentinel, stood the old lighthouse, its paint weathered, its windows clouded, its purpose nearly obsolete. Few ships passed here now, and fewer people still remembered the man who kept the light burning. Inside, Ethan Hale sat in silence. He had once been a man of movement, a coastal engineer, a sailor, a husband, but those titles had faded with time and tragedy. Now, at 54, he wore solitude like a second skin. The lighthouse had become his refuge after losing everything that mattered. His wife, Mara, to a sudden illness, and his only son to distance and silence. Ethan hadn't spoken to anyone in months, save the grocery boy who left supplies by the dock once a week and never stayed long enough for conversation. But all of that changed the night he heard her singing. It was just past midnight when the melody drifted through the fog. Ethan had been logging the lighthouse's logbook, a habit more than a duty now, when the sound made him pause mid-sentence. A girl's voice, clear but fragile, laced with the ache of someone who had lived too much sorrow too soon. The wind carried the song from the base of the cliff, near the empty boathouse, where no boats had docked in years. Ethan stood, heart thudding, not with fear, but with the kind of unfamiliar anticipation that made him feel alive again. He took the winding stairs down and stepped into the night, the beam from the lighthouse rotating behind him in slow, ghostly arcs. There, sitting on a moss-covered stone with nothing but a weather-beaten guitar in her lap, was a young woman. Her name, he would learn later, was Isla. At that moment, she didn't look up. She just kept singing. Something about the sea, and time, and someone she missed. Her voice, though quiet, filled the space around her, as if the cliffs themselves leaned in to listen. Ethan remained still, not wanting to intrude on what felt like a sacred ritual, but something inside him shifted. For the first time in years, he wasn't just hearing the wind and waves. He was listening. Oh, wow! And that made all the difference. The next night, she returned. Anjao. Ethan hadn't expected her to. After all, Marrow Bay was not a place people stumbled into twice. Yet, as the sky dimmed into that silvery shade between dusk and darkness, and the lighthouse beam began its slow rotation across the sea, Ethan heard it again, that same delicate voice rising above the tide. A little stronger now, a little braver, still tinged with sadness but steadier, like a candle burning against the wind. This time, he watched from the window. Waitress. Isla sat cross-legged on the same stone, bundled in a threadbare hoodie, her guitar resting gently across her knees. She sang with her eyes closed, head tilted toward the ocean like it might sing back. The song was different now, something slower, more personal. A whisper of memories wrapped in melody. When she finished, she simply sat there, watching the water, unmoving. Then she left. Atetig now. Ethan didn't sleep much that night. Atetig now. The next day, he descended the long, spiraling stairs and ventured to the edge of the cliff where she'd been. A few cigarette butts, a crushed paper coffee cup, and a crumpled page torn from a journal were all that remained. On it, written in large, uneven handwriting. No one listens anymore, but maybe the sea still does. The words lingered in his mind long after he returned to the tower. Who was she? Why here? Why now? Night after night, Isla returned. Sometimes she sang. Sometimes she just sat in silence. And Ethan, though he never went down, always listened. He began to leave things where she'd sit. A thermos of tea, a wool blanket, once even a weatherproof poncho before a storm rolled in. He never left a note. She never left a thank you until the sixth night. That evening, the tea was gone. In its place, tucked carefully under a small stone, was a folded napkin with one line scribbled across it in blue ink. Your tea is terrible, but I needed it. Thank you. Ethan chuckled genuinely for the first time in years. Something unspoken was forming between them, an invisible string tied between the lighthouse and the stone. Words weren't exchanged, but they didn't need to be. Isla sang, and Ethan listened. That was enough. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Isla had her own reasons for coming here. Reasons buried deep in grief and guilt, and a past she couldn't rewrite. But in singing to the sea, she was not trying to be heard. She was trying not to disappear. And in the most unexpected of places, someone was finally listening. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of their silent companionship became a strange comfort. Neither of them dared to disturb. Isla still came every night, sometimes with her guitar, sometimes just to sit and listen to the surf. The songs she sang were always different, some original, some old folk ballads, and once a broken rendition of Leonard Cohen's famous Blue Raincoat that made Ethan's throat tighten. He still hadn't spoken to her, hadn't dared, but he left fresh tea every time, sometimes with honey, and Isla, grateful, perhaps amused, always left something behind in return. A pine cone shaped like a heart, a scribbled lyric. One night, a tiny origami boat made from sheet music, perhuas. But then came the night she didn't return. The silence outside felt heavier than any storm. Ethan waited by the window for hours, eyes scanning the path from the mainland. Nothing. No voice, no guitar, just the wind and the waves, indifferent as ever. And the next night, still nothing. Boom way. Something in Ethan's chest pulled tight. By the third night, he descended the spiral staircase and followed the path to the base of the cliffs, lantern in hand. The stone where Isla usually sat was cold and bare. The tea thermos still sat untouched from 2 nights prior. He stood in the moonlight, listening, hoping. Nothing came. Ethan didn't sleep. He told himself she might have moved on, that she had no obligation to return. But the thought sat bitter in his gut. Something was wrong. She'd once scrawled a lyric that said, "You don't sing to the sea unless you're sinking." And Ethan had been around the sea long enough to know what that meant. The following morning, against all his instincts, he hiked into town for the first time in months. The roads were unfamiliar now. Shops had closed. A new coffee place had opened. But the town was still small enough for word to travel quickly. When he reached the corner bulletin board outside the post office, his heart sank. A weather-worn flyer, taped to the wood, showed Isla's face. Eyes soft, smile barely there, and beneath it the words, "Missing. Last seen near the cliffs at Merrow Bay." She had vanished. Sporux. Ethan stood there frozen, 1,000 thoughts colliding in his mind. The guitar, the lyrics, the silence, Spormin, and then the guilt. He had listened night after night, but he had never answered, never spoken, never asked who she was or why she came. And now she was gone. Worry time. But she hadn't left him entirely, Sime Fashichi styrely. That night, as he sat in the lighthouse keeper's chair, he played the audio file on his old tape recorder, the one he had dusted off after hearing her first song. He had started recording her from the second week. Not to steal her voice, but to preserve it. To remember. Her final song, recorded 4 nights before she disappeared, was short, soft, a lullaby. If I go where no one finds me, let the sea be my last friend. If I drift into the silence, play my song until the end. The tape clicked to a stop. Ethan sat still, and then, for the first time in years, he moved with purpose. The storm hit Merrow Bay 3 days after Isla vanished. It was the kind the locals whispered about long after it passed. Brutal, biblical, the kind that tore roofs from cottages and split boats like driftwood. Waves pounded the cliffs, hungry and unforgiving. The lighthouse groaned under the force of the wind, its beam flickering but never going out. Alti. Ethan didn't leave his post. He hadn't since he returned from town. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping. He only listened to the sea, to the silence, to the echo of her voice playing endlessly on his recorder. He replayed her final lullaby again and again as if decoding it might undo the vanishing. And then, on the 3rd night of the storm, something appeared. A figure, soaked to the bone, staggering along the lower path by the shoreline. Ethan blinked, heart racing. He grabbed his lantern and ran down the narrow staircase out into the rain. The cliffs were slick, the mud threatening to drag him down, but he didn't stop. He found her. Isla was lying near the edge of the bluff, curled like a child, her guitar case beside her, cracked and rain-drenched. Her lips were blue, her eyes closed, but her chest rose and fell. Barely. "Isla," he whispered, kneeling beside her, hands trembling as he touched her cheek. "You're here. You came back." Her eyes fluttered. She tried to speak, but her voice was gone, too hoarse, too tired. Instead, she reached weakly into her jacket pocket and pulled out a folded paper. She pressed it into his hand before slipping back into unconsciousness. Ethan carried her back to the lighthouse, his arms aching, his breath coming in gasps, but his grip never loosened. He lit every oil lamp he owned, wrapped her in every blanket he could find, boiled tea, fed her sips of honey and broth, sat by her side until morning. When the storm finally broke and the first sliver of sun cut through the clouds, Isla opened her eyes again. She whispered only one thing. "Why did you wait so long to say something?" Ethan choked back tears. "I didn't know how," he said. "I forgot what it meant to care." She looked at him for a long moment. Then slowly, painfully, she reached out and took his hand. And just like that, the silence between them cracked open. The note she had given him before fainting was soaked through, but the ink had mostly held. It said, "If this is goodbye, thank you for listening. I didn't think anyone still could." He stared at those words long into the next night. But something had changed. This wasn't goodbye. Not anymore. Isla stayed at the lighthouse for 3 days after the storm. She slept in the small guest cot beneath the spiral stairs, wrapped in wool blankets, her body slowly recovering from the cold and exhaustion. Her voice remained hoarse, a faint whisper of what it had been, but her presence filled the tower in ways Ethan hadn't realized he'd missed. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. In the quiet, Ethan brewed tea that didn't taste like seawater anymore. Isla sipped it slowly and smiled with her eyes. She would sometimes hum. No words, just melody. And Ethan would find himself listening with the reverence of a man hearing a hymn for the first time. Her guitar was damaged, one string snapped. The wood split along the edge, but she kept it close beside her bed, like a lifeline. On the third evening, the sea calmed. The sun broke through the overcast, casting golden ribbons over the waves. Ethan helped Isla up the stairs to the lighthouse balcony. The view was endless, miles of water catching light like glass. The wind was gentle, brushing against their skin like memory. They stood in silence, side by side. "I thought I was going to let go," Isla said at last, voice gravelly, soft. Ethan looked at her. "Why didn't you?" She turned to him, eyes brighter than he remembered. "Because someone was listening." That night, for the first time, Ethan played. The old upright piano on the lower level hadn't been touched in years. Dust covered the keys. Some stuck. Some let out crooked, warbling notes. But his fingers remembered. He wiped the surface clean, sat down slowly, and let his hands fall into an old waltz. One Mara had loved, one he hadn't dared play since her passing. Isla sat nearby, guitar cradled in her lap, silently watching. When he finished, she didn't speak. She simply stood, walked over, and laid her palm on the top of the piano. "Let's fix it," she whispered. "Together." And so they did. Day by day, note by note, string by string. Her guitar was repaired with glue and careful wrapping. The piano was tuned, imperfectly, charmingly. They played quietly at first, then bolder, then with laughter, then with something else neither of them dared name. Until one morning, Ethan blinked at the light, pouring in through the tower window, and realized he was no longer just surviving. He was awake. And so was she. The lighthouse had always belonged to silence, but now it belonged to sound. Soft chords drifted up the spiral staircase in the early mornings. Laughter echoed off the stone walls during breakfast. At night, melodies wove through the sea wind like prayers no longer whispered but sung aloud. Ethan had not spoken this much in years, not even to himself. Isla, for all her quiet edges, had brought noise back into his world. Not the kind that overwhelmed, but the kind that healed. Still, there were things she didn't say. Questions Ethan never asked. One foggy afternoon, while Isla was out sketching the coastline in her worn notebook, he found a crumpled envelope tucked behind one of the lantern oil cans on the upper landing. His name wasn't on it, but the writing was hers. Hesitant? Raw? He hesitated. Then he opened it. Ethan, if I ever disappear again, please don't think I ran from you. I've spent most of my life running, but what we've found here, this stillness, this music, it's the first thing that's made me want to stay. I came to the cliffs to vanish. You gave me a reason not to. But there are pieces of my past I haven't faced, and they won't stop chasing me unless I turn around. If I leave, it's only to find the rest of me. If I come back, it's because I want to be whole, with you, Isla. His hands shook. That evening, he didn't confront her. He simply handed her the repaired guitar and asked if she wanted to play outside. She smiled and followed. But the letter changed something. He knew now she wasn't meant to stay forever. Not yet. Her wounds were not just from the sea or a broken childhood or failed promises. They were deeper, the kind no one else could fix. She needed space. Time. Maybe even distance. Distance. So when she left 2 mornings later, leaving behind nothing but a dried sea daisy and a note that said, "I'll come back to the light if it's still burning," Ethan didn't panic. He packed up the lighthouse in quiet reverence, kept the tea warm, and played the piano every sunset. He didn't know where she had gone, but he knew she'd follow the music home. Still, waiting wasn't enough. So he began the search. Ethan was not a man of the digital world. His phone, dusty and mostly ignored for years, had barely a dozen contacts, most of them outdated or deceased. He didn't use social media. He didn't know how to search handles or follow tags. But love, or whatever this blooming ache for Isla had become, has a strange way of teaching old hearts new tricks. So he learned. He started with the one thing she had always trusted to speak for her, her voice. The lighthouse's old cassette recorder had been faithfully capturing her music every night since the second week she began to sing. Ethan digitized the tapes, uploading short clips to a music sharing site under the name Songs from the Stone. He tagged them with things she'd once scribbled in her notebook. Hashtag saltwater lullaby, hashtag coastal girl, hashtag lost and louder. He didn't expect much, but the internet did what it does best. It listened. Within days, people began to share the recordings. Comments trickled in. "This sounds like someone I used to see busking outside Union Market." The voice. "She played open mics in Portland last fall, I swear it. Is her name Isla? I met a girl who sang like this. She smelled like jasmine and rain." That last one stopped Ethan cold. Jasmine. It was the scent of the tiny bottle she had left behind on the windowsill. It still lingered in the tower like a ghost in bloom. With renewed determination, he posted a message. "She once sang to the sea when she thought no one was listening. If you know where she is, tell her the light's still burning. E." A week passed. Then, late one night, as a storm stirred far offshore, Ethan's email lit up with a message. Subject: "I saw her." From LS. "She's in Monterey, singing in a bar called The Wreck. Just a girl with a cracked guitar and a smile that doesn't quite reach her eyes. I think she's waiting for something. Or someone." Ethan packed a bag before dawn. He took the ferry to the mainland, caught a train, then a bus, then walked the final mile. His knees ached and his hands trembled, but nothing could slow him. Outside the wreck, the sky was streaked with orange. The ocean sang its endless lullaby. And through the open window, he heard her. Isla, singing. The same voice that once rose through fog and waves like a lifeline. Only this time, she wasn't singing to the sea. Mencisles. She was singing for him. Muses. Kamachua, the wreck was a dim little bar with weathered stools, string lights that flickered more than they shined, and a stage barely large enough for a microphone and a guitar. But to Ethan, it felt like the center of the universe. He stood just inside the doorway, motionless. There she was, Isla, sitting on a stool with her eyes half closed, a patched-up guitar in her lap and a microphone barely picking up the quiet weight of her voice. She wore a denim jacket with the sleeves rolled to the elbows and a simple black dress, but the moment she sang, she looked luminous. The song wasn't one he recognized. It was hers, honest and aching, with lyrics that fell like sea glass, worn, broken, beautiful. I sang to the wind, thinking it would forget me, but it carried my voice. To someone I didn't know was listening. Ethan's breath hitched. She was telling his story. Their story. Isla's eyes scanned the room as she reached the chorus, and when they landed on him, when she saw him standing there in his old wool coat, salt still in his beard, eyes filled with everything he'd never dared say, her voice caught. Just slightly. But she didn't stop singing. She finished the song with her eyes locked on his. And in that gaze was recognition, forgiveness, and something he'd feared might never return. Hope. The crowd offered soft applause, but Isla didn't acknowledge it. She slid off the stool, guitar in hand, and walked straight toward him. The noise of the room blurred. It felt like the lighthouse all over again, just the two of them, surrounded by things that didn't matter. "Hey," she whispered, standing inches from him. "Hey," he replied, his voice gruff but steady. "You came." "I never stopped listening," he said. She didn't cry, neither did he. Instead, she smiled the kind of smile that only comes when you find the person who makes the world quiet again. They didn't hug right away. They just stood there for a beat too long, both afraid to move in case it broke the spell. But finally, Ethan reached out, gently brushing her knuckles with his. "Ready to come home?" he asked softly. Isla looked down at her old guitar, then back at him. "Only if you'll play the piano." His answering smile was all the yes she needed. They returned to Morro Bay 2 days later. The lighthouse looked the same, weather-beaten, proud, still standing like it had been waiting for them both. But to Ethan and Isla, it felt entirely new. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was filled with possibility. They spent their first evening back watching the sun disappear behind the waves, sitting on the balcony in shared stillness. No music, no words. Just breathing the same sea air, side by side. But the music returned quickly. Within a week, the piano downstairs was being played daily. Ethan, at first reluctantly, then with something that resembled joy. Isla sang in the mornings, sometimes barefoot, sometimes off-key, and Ethan found he loved those moments best. They repaired the inside of the lighthouse together, added color to the walls, and turned the second floor into a makeshift studio. He replaced the broken window panes. She collected sea glass and placed it on the sills to catch the afternoon light. Then one morning, Isla stood in the doorway holding a flyer she had picked up in town. Coastal Arts Festival, local talent showcase at the pier stage. She held it up to him. "We should go." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "As in, attend?" "As in, perform," she replied, eyes gleaming with quiet challenge. He shook his head slowly, but there was a smile playing at his lips. "I haven't played in front of anyone in 20 years. You played for me. That was different." "No," she said gently, "that was real." So they signed up. A week later, under the soft light of strung lanterns and the scent of grilled fish and salty popcorn, Ethan and Isla stepped onto a small stage overlooking the water. The pier was crowded with families, artists, locals with folding chairs, and a few curious tourists. No one expected much from the unassuming couple setting up at sunset, until they began to play. Malum, Ethan's hands, once hesitant, now moved with memory and grace. Isla's voice, steady and full, wrapped around his chords like it had always belonged there. The song they chose was simple, no flashy runs or overdone crescendos. Just a tune about the sea, about second chances, and about finding someone when you thought the world had forgotten your name. By the time they reached the final verse, the pier was utterly silent, and when they finished, the crowd rose, not with the roar of a stadium, but with the warmth of people who recognized something true. Later, after the applause had faded and the stage lights dimmed, a small child approached them with her mother. The girl clutched a seashell in one hand and said softly, "Your song made me feel brave." Isla bent down, her heart catching. "Thank you. That means more than you know." The girl beamed and ran back to her seat. Ethan looked at Isla. "You know we're gonna have to do this again." She laughed. "Only if you keep playing." And just like that, the man who had once only watched from the window became the man on stage, because she had sung him back to life, and the girl who had once come to vanish? She had become someone the world now leaned in to hear. The invitations to perform kept coming. Small stages, coastal cafes, even a late-night radio show that featured undiscovered voices of the shoreline. But Isla and Ethan weren't chasing fame. They turned down more gigs than they accepted. Instead, they played when it felt right, when the night was quiet enough for honesty, and the room gentle enough to hold it. Still, their music reached people. One evening, after a performance at a seaside chapel, nothing fancy, just worn pews and open windows letting in the sound of the surf, a quiet man approached them. He wore a slate-gray coat, buttoned to the top, and carried a weathered satchel over one shoulder. His hair was silver at the temples, and his eyes had the look of someone who had survived many storms, inside and out. "Isla Grace?" he asked softly, holding out something wrapped in linen. She nodded, cautious. "Yes." "I think this belongs to you." She unwrapped it carefully. It was a wooden frame. Inside it, pressed, protected, preserved, was a small piece of torn notebook paper. Her own handwriting. "If I go where no one finds me, let the sea be my last friend. If I drift into the silence, play my song until the end." Isla's breath caught. "I found this," the man said, "in a recording archive submitted anonymously to a healing arts collective. It had no name, no location, just your voice and this verse. For months I kept it on my wall, not knowing who you were. But then I heard you sing tonight." He smiled. "I wanted to thank you. Your voice reminded me I still had one of my own." Ethan stepped closer, resting a hand on Isla's shoulder. She looked at the man, eyes filled with something deeper than words. "I wrote this the night I thought I wouldn't come back," she whispered. "And yet you did," the man said, nodding. "And now you're bringing others with you." He turned, disappearing into the night before they could ask his name. Isla stood, holding the frame against her chest. That night, back at the lighthouse, they placed it above the piano, right where the sunrise would hit it first. "You once said no one was listening," Ethan murmured. She smiled. "I think I was wrong." The frame above the piano became a quiet beacon in their home. Visitors would notice it first, not because it was ornate, but because it radiated something unspoken. They'd ask about the words, and Isla would smile softly, sometimes answering, sometimes just letting the silence explain it better than she could. She and Ethan continued to play, not for stages now, but for the people who came looking for something they couldn't name: wounded artists, widowed sailors. A teenage girl with shaking hands, who hadn't spoken in weeks, but hummed along to the final verse of a song called Saltlight. They didn't charge. They never asked for names. They just played. And every night, before the tea kettle hissed and the lighthouse light made its final turn across the bay, Ethan would open the window near the piano and let the last note drift into the dark. "We send it out," he once said, "in case someone else is listening like I was." Isla's voice had changed, stronger now, clearer, but it carried the same ache. the same warmth of someone who had known both drowning and breath. And when she sang Fix You, just once during a memorial for a local fisherman, it felt as if time folded in on itself. The room had stilled. Ethan's fingers, firm on the keys, trembled slightly when she reached the line. Lights will guide you home. They had come so far from the cliffside and the silence. Yet the music, that one song especially, still held their story like an anchor. A promise, a beginning. People remembered it. Weeks later, a boy who had heard the performance ran up to Isla with a scrap of cardboard and said, "Can you write the name of the song down? I want to play it on my phone every night." She did, and as the boy skipped away, Ethan murmured beside her, "That's the song they won't forget." Isla smiled, but her eyes shimmered with tears. Neither of them said it out loud, but both knew why it mattered. Because that song hadn't just fixed him, it had fixed her too. And sometimes, when the right voice meets the right silence, what's born isn't just healing, it's memory. The night he proposed, the sea was calm. Morro Bay shimmered under a full moon, the tide sighing gently against the rocks like a lullaby just waking from sleep. The lighthouse had finished its final sweep, and the world below was quiet, cloaked in silver and salt. Wones Morro was domos nitis orate. Ethan had planned nothing grand. No crowd, no stage, just a promise. Wone. Isla stood barefoot on the edge of the cliff, her hair swept back by the breeze, her guitar resting in its case beside her. They had spent the afternoon collecting driftwood and building a small bonfire on the beach, a tradition they shared every full moon. But tonight, he had packed something else in the canvas bag, a small velvet pouch that felt impossibly heavy for its size. She was humming to herself, something old and wordless when he approached. "Isla," he said softly. She turned, that same look in her eyes she'd had the first time he saw her on the rocks below. Vulnerable, untamed, steady. He took her hands. "There are no verses for this," he began. "No lyrics that say it better than silence could. But I'll try." She laughed through her nose, already tearing up. "I never expected to wake up," he continued. "Not just from that bed. From everything. I was surviving. But then I heard you, your voice, your stories, your heartbeat in every broken note. You didn't just sing to me, you called me home." Isla said nothing, her fingers tightening around his. "I don't need a perfect song. I just want to be the one playing behind you when you find your voice again and again. I want mornings by the sea and quiet evenings by the fire. I want whatever this is, messy, sacred, ours." He knelt. From his pocket, he took the velvet pouch and pulled out a ring, simple, silver, with a blue sea glass stone at the center. "Will you marry me, Isla Grace?" Her breath caught, and for a moment the waves seemed to pause too. Then she dropped to her knees with him, kissed his forehead, and whispered, "Only if you never stop playing for me." He smiled, slipped the ring onto her finger, and they stayed there, two people who had once been strangers to themselves, now tethered by something stronger than music. That night, they didn't go back inside. They stayed by the fire until dawn, wrapped in one blanket, tracing constellations and swapping unfinished lyrics. And when the first light touched the horizon, Isla sang a new song. It had no chorus, no name, just Ethan's hand in hers. And the moon, still listening. They moved into the cottage 2 months after the proposal. It sat just beyond the lighthouse path, half hidden by dune grass and salt-washed pines, a modest white structure with sea-blue shutters and a crooked chimney that always smelled faintly of cinnamon and driftwood. It had once belonged to a retired fisherman who carved poems into the floorboards and painted seagulls on every cupboard. Isla loved it instantly. "This place," she whispered when they stepped through the door, "feels like a melody that's been waiting for lyrics." Ethan only smiled. "Then let's write them." They kept the lighthouse as a studio, a place for playing, recording, teaching, but the cottage became their home. The kitchen always held the scent of chamomile tea and fresh bread. The living room was lined with old sheet music, photographs of windswept beaches, and a piano that had belonged to Ethan's mother, now tuned and loved again. Children from the nearby village came for weekly music sessions. Some brought ukuleles too big for their hands. Some didn't speak, only tapped rhythms on the floor. Isla would sit cross-legged with them, teaching them how to hum their feelings, how to trust silence between sounds. Ethan played bass notes to steady them all, anchor lines beneath trembling treble. They never advertised. People simply came and stayed. One morning, a young man in his 20s, shy, tattooed, clearly lost, showed up at their gate holding nothing but a weathered cassette player. "Someone sent me your tape," he said quietly. "It made me want to live." Isla took his hand. "Then stay a while. We'll teach you how to listen to yourself again." The cottage became more than a home. It became a refuge. Seko lives. A place for broken chords to find harmony. Misrepresentate me. They painted the porch yellow, planted lavender near the windows, and hung wind chimes made from old guitar strings and shells. At night, Isla would sing on the steps while Ethan tuned his guitar beside her, both of them barefoot, the stars caught in their hair like secrets. And sometimes, without warning, one of them would pause, look at the other, and smile in that way that meant, "We made it. We survived. This is the song we never knew we were writing." The idea came quietly, the way most important things do. Moled. They were sitting on the sand one morning, watching the tide pull sleepy patterns in the surf. Ethan was tuning a borrowed 12-string guitar. Isla was humming into a small recorder, just sketching melodies the way some people sketch clouds. She paused, thoughtful. "What if we shared it?" she asked. Ethan looked up. "Shared what?" "This," she said, gesturing to the air between them. "The songs. Not just the polished ones we perform, but the ones we wrote when we were broken. The ones we wrote before we even knew we were healing." He set the guitar aside. "You're talking about an album." "I'm talking about a lighthouse in the form of music," she replied softly. "Something someone out there might need the way I once needed your silence, the way you needed my voice." He didn't hesitate. "Then we'll make it." They called it Stone and Light, a reference to where it all began. The cold cliffside rock she once sat on, singing to no one, and the beam that swept silently through fog, reminding lost ships they weren't alone. The tracks were raw, intimate. Most were first takes, never corrected for perfection. You could hear the breath between verses, the creak of floorboards, even the cry of a gull in the distance. Listened. He wasn't commercial, it wasn't trendy. He was true. He was true. Listen. They recorded 12 songs. Fix Me, Don't Save Me, The Note Under the Lantern, Lullaby from the Cliff, Cold Hands, Open Window, Jasmine and Driftwood, The Lighthouse Sleeps, Before I Knew Your Name, In Case You're Listening, Unfinished Verse, The Fire Stayed Lit, Stone and Light, title track, second chorus, the final track, recorded live on the porch during a summer rain. They released the album quietly online with a single caption, "For anyone who ever sang into the dark and hoped someone would hear." We did, and we're singing back. Within days, messages poured in. From mothers, widowers, former soldiers, runaway teens, ICU nurses, hospice workers, and music teachers. People from cities and small towns, from rooftops and hospital rooms. Many didn't say much, just a line or two. I felt this in my bones. I played it for someone who can't wake up. Track 7 made me cry, and I didn't know I still could. Thank you for making me feel less alone. They didn't reply to every message, but they read them all, and each one felt like a thread being tied between strangers who would never meet, connected by pain, healing, and the simple magic of a shared note. When Isla held the first printed vinyl in her hands, she ran her fingers across the words pressed into the sleeve. "The album named after hope." She whispered, "This wasn't just for them, was it?" Ethan smiled beside her, eyes damp. It never was. The night of the album's launch concert was nothing like they had imagined. Dala! There were no flashing lights, no velvet ropes or backstage chaos. Just a small open-air theater tucked beside the bay, wooden benches warmed by late summer sun, and a sky full of stars that seemed to lean closer with every note. People came with blankets and thermoses. Some brought children, Some came alone. Some came not for the music, but for what it represented. Hope, return, survival. Ethan stood backstage, adjusting the collar of his faded navy shirt. His hands weren't trembling this time, not out of fear at least. Isla stood beside him in a simple sea-green dress, her hair loose, her guitar polished but still bearing its old scar near the neck, a reminder of the night she almost didn't return. She looked over the crowd and exhaled. "Do you think they'll understand?" Ethan gently reached for her hand. "They already do." Their set was quiet, honest, unadorned. They sang the story of the lighthouse, of the silence that listened, of the voice that refused to vanish. They told it not through monologues or memoir, but through harmonies and pauses, through shared glances and the slight catch in Isla's throat when she sang the last line of "Fix me, don't save me. And if I never wake again, thank you for staying in the dark long enough to find me." The crowd didn't roar when they finished. They stood, hands on hearts, eyes wet, like something holy had been offered and received. Afterward, under the soft murmur of waves, an old man with shaking hands approached and pressed a folded note into Ethan's palm. "I listened to your album every night in the hospital," he said. "It made me want to live long enough to tell you that." Ethan hugged him. No words, just understanding. Back at the lighthouse, they lit candles along the windowsill and left the studio door open. The breeze carried the last notes of their final song back toward the sea, just in case someone was still out there, listening in the dark. Isla curled beside Ethan on the porch, her head on his shoulder. "Do you think this is our ending?" He smiled. "No." She lifted her head. "Then what is it?" He took her hand and tapped it softly, like the rhythm of a metronome. "The chorus before forever." She kissed him. And somewhere beyond the cliffs, beyond the tide and the years, and the silence that once held them both captive, a lighthouse beam swept across the water one more time. Still shining. Still listening. If this story moved you, reminded you that healing is real, or renewed your belief in second chances, we invite you to subscribe to Healing Stories. Here, we share real-life journeys of strength, love, and hope. Stories that speak straight to the soul. Thank you for being here. And always remember, no matter how far you fall, there's always a way back to the light. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let us know.